Imagine, just for a second, taking the engine out of a perfectly calibrated billion-dollar machine. That is exactly the cinematic, almost insurmountable reality Manchester City is staring down right now. Look, we aren't just talking about replacing a name on a roster here. We're talking about replacing the absolute heartbeat of a modern football dynasty. A Ballon d'Or winning midfield mastermind whose very presence basically dictated the rhythm, tempo, and literal geometry of English and European football. I mean, think back to Istanbul in 2023. The tension in that stadium is suffocating. The Champions League final is hanging by a thread, and who steps up to deliver the shattering, decisive blow? It's Rodri. The guy was the ultimate insurance policy and the ultimate weapon, all rolled into one. But after 14 grueling months, largely sidelined by that devastating ACL injury against Arsenal, a bunch of agonizing medical relapses, and playing just 588 minutes of football, the inevitable finally happened. The Spanish maestro officially packed his bags for Barcelona, leaving behind this massive, gaping crater in the center of the pitch. So, welcome to today's Explainer. Today, we are diving deep into the monumental, existential challenge facing Manchester City's boardroom and coaching staff. Because the question is, how on earth do you replace the irreplaceable?
Well, the cold, hard truth of the modern game is that finding a direct replica is virtually impossible. Just listen to this hauntingly pragmatic realization from manager Enzo Maresca. As a former Guardiola disciple, he intimately understands the tactical demands of this system, and he summed up the sheer impossibility of the modern transfer market perfectly. I'll try to find a new Rodri. It is what it is. There's absolutely no sugarcoating going on here. Maresca's words totally capture the dread of every top-tier manager out there trying to hunt down a unicorn. Remember, before Rodri arrived in Manchester from Atletico Madrid, he hadn't won the Ballon d'Or, he hadn't won a Champions League or a Club World Cup. It was the meticulously demanding environment of this specific club that forged him into the global icon he became. And now, the organization has to operate this insanely complex tactical machine while it's suddenly missing its most foundational pillar. It's this stark, terrifying realization that they've got to adapt and fast to a brutal landscape without their ultimate linchpin anchoring the midfield.
£65.4 million. That's the ruthless financial reality of the situation right there. That is the exact fee Barcelona paid to bring the 30-year-old midfielder back to Spain on a 4-year contract. Now, at first glance, for a reigning Ballon d'Or winner operating at the absolute peak of his mental powers, you might be thinking, wow, that number seems like an absolute steal. But in the ultra-clinical world of elite football economics, we've got to contextualize this a bit. Rodri was entering the final 12 months of his contract, and high-stakes talks for an extension had completely stalled out. So when you factor in the massive physical toll of a catastrophic ACL tear, those muscular relapses that plagued his rehab, and the undeniable fact that he's crossing into his 30s, City's boardroom had to make a really calculated, incredibly difficult business decision. As the guys furiously debated over on the City Ramble podcast, a lot of purist fans would have vastly preferred just keeping him for one final year, taking the complete financial hit just to have his aura in the dressing room. But the hierarchy opted to cash in, securing a solid financial return to violently jumpstart their next chapter. To really grasp the panic setting in, you have to understand exactly what they are losing. 7 seasons, 4 Premier League titles, 1 Champions League, 1 Ballon d'Or. The sheer magnitude of his legacy is just staggering. He was a human metronome who, at one point, rarely lost a single match for over a year. But it wasn't just the gleaming silverware in the trophy cabinet. It was the man himself. The storytelling around his departure really highlighted this profound, almost jarring humility for a superstar of his caliber. I mean, this is a guy who, at the peak of his fame, was literally spotted queuing for a budget commercial airline to fly home to Spain. No flashy tattoos, no massive entourage, and in his farewell message, he didn't just rattle off your standard PR thank yous to the executives. No, he looked right down the barrel of the camera and thanked the working-class city of Manchester. He talked about his genuine pride in his brother graduating from a local university. And he specifically shouted out the NHS, where his girlfriend actually worked during his time in England. He was just a world-class talent who remained utterly grounded. A Premier League great who left behind a legacy that fundamentally reshaped the modern history of the sport. All right, let's move into part 1, City's history of succession, finding the next icon. So if there is one thing this ruthless organization knows how to do, it's rebuild from the ashes of departing legends. Think back for a second to the sheer existential panic that swept through the fan base when previous generational talents packed up and left. When the magical David Silva departed back in 2020, pundits were everywhere wondering if the creative lifeblood of the team was just going to dry up completely. But Kevin De Bruyne was already being molded behind the scenes to take the ultimate mantle and elevate the system even further. When the legendary Sergio Aguero left and the traditional striker role looked terrifyingly barren, they pivoted. They played a false nine system for a bit and eventually dropped in the robotic inevitability of Erling Haaland. And when the cynical, master of the dark arts Fernandinho finally moved on in 2022, yep, that is exactly when Rodri stepped out of the shadows and evolved into the undisputed best defensive midfielder in the world. City's history of succession is practically an industrial art form at this point. Finding the next icon is just part of the relentless, unforgiving cycle of the club. It's a calculated change for them, not a fatal problem. They've executed this blueprint flawlessly before. Which brings us to part 2, internal pretenders to the throne. The contrast here is incredibly stark, and it really highlights the immense psychological weight of having to step into a legend's shadow. On one side, you've got the departing master, Rodri, 30 years old, battle-tested in the absolute highest pressure cookers of European football, and holding 100% of Pep Guardiola's unwavering trust. Then, on the other side, you've got the internal heir apparent, Nico Gonzalez. He stands an imposing 6'2", got brought in from Porto for a pretty substantial sum, and he's just 23 years old. Guardiola literally labeled him the young Rodri last season, which, let's be honest, thrusts an impossible level of expectation right onto the kid's shoulders. Physically and stylistically, yeah, he's almost a carbon copy. But here's the massive, undeniable risk. The kid desperately needs high-level minutes. Against Bournemouth, there were these glaring moments where he was caught dwelling on the ball, getting dispossessed in dangerous areas in ways a prime Rodri simply would never allow. And as the experts on the City Ramble pointed out, if Gonzalez doesn't get significant, consistent playing time to learn the system's brutal geometry, he risks being what they call James Trafforded. If you're unfamiliar, that basically means being bought as a highly touted prospect, never getting a real shot in the first team, and then being quietly sold off for profit and sustainability compliance to a club like Newcastle or Liverpool. If that happens, City's going to be left staring into a massive black hole in midfield 3 years from now. So, if Nico Gonzalez isn't the immediate, magical answer, the tactical reality of the alternatives gets highly complicated. Let's break down the internal stopgaps real quick. First up, you have Mateo Kovacic. He's 32, highly proven, with this glittering resume featuring Real Madrid, Inter Milan, and Chelsea, but he's a ball carrier, not a true anchor. Plus, he's battling ongoing chronic ankle issues, making relying on him for 50-plus games a massive gamble. Next is the brilliant academy graduate, 21-year-old Rico Lewis. The kid possesses the boundless energy and elite technical control required in a Guardiola system. Yet, Guardiola himself has publicly cited Lewis's lack of height and sheer physical strength as a dangerous drawback for the lone pivot role in the incredibly physical Premier League, where set pieces can literally destroy you. Finally, there's John Stones, the Barnsley Beckenbauer. He shone brilliantly stepping into a hybrid midfield role during that 2023 Champions League run. But as Stones himself admitted in interviews, his biggest struggle as a natural center-back moving forward is spatial awareness. Think about it. When you play in defense, the entire pitch is right in front of you. But when you play as a lone six, you're operating in a 360-degree environment. You've got elite athletes pressing you from your blind spots constantly. Learning exactly where to receive the ball on the half-turn under intense, suffocating pressure is arguably the hardest job in world football. Now, given the unforgiving standard at the Etihad, we have to briefly dismiss the unlikely internal options who simply don't make the grade, the outsiders, if you will. Calvin Phillips is 29 and has operated as a deep defensive midfielder a solid 164 times in his pro career. He showed enough absolute quality to win England's Player of the Year once upon a time, but it is glaringly, painfully evident he simply lacks Guardiola's tactical faith. He just can't process the ball fast enough for what this system demands. Then there's Matias Nunes. The Brazilian-born Portugal international cost an absolute fortune, but fundamentally, he's an attacking drifter. He has only played 9 matches as a holding midfielder in his entire career. Sure, he managed an assist playing there against Nottingham Forest back in September 2023, but it's pretty safe to say neither of these two guys are the long-term structural solution for a club whose baseline goal is conquering Europe. Okay, part 3. External transfer targets, the financial cost. £115 million. Just let that astronomical number hang in the air for a second. That is the club record fee Manchester City dropped just to sign Elliot Anderson from Nottingham Forest this summer. And this provides a stark, terrifying visual contrast to the $65.4 million they received for one of the greatest midfielders in history. To replace a world-class player in today's hyperinflated market, you are going to pay an exorbitant premium. It's often referred to as the City tax. The second European clubs know Manchester City is desperate and backed by massive ownership wealth, bam,
the asking price doubles. The days of unearthing a hidden gem for £20 million are pretty much over for a club of this immense stature. If they want a guaranteed, ready-made successor who can instantly plug into a Champions League winning squad without missing a single beat, they are going to have to crack open the vault and shatter spending records all over again.
So looking out, the external shortlist is this fascinating mix of raw potential and proven pedigree. The £115 million man, Elliot Anderson, is already adapting in the building. But the net is cast much wider across Europe right now. You've got Johnny Reinders, who arrived at City from Milan, initially billed as a creative De Bruyne's successor. But fascinatingly, he started as a defensive midfielder in a tight 1-0 setback at Aston Villa, giving us a really cool glimpse into Guardiola's tactical laboratory. The club is also reportedly in advanced high-stakes talks for Lille's Moroccan teenage sensation, Ayoub Bouadi, a player with an incredibly high ceiling. And according to some deep dives by BBC Sport, the recruitment team hasn't given up hope on incredibly ambitious blockbuster raids for Chelsea's Enzo Fernandez or Liverpool's Alexis McAllister. McAllister has that World Cup-winning pedigree and the supreme intelligence to dictate the tempo of a game, while Enzo possesses the expansive passing range Guardiola absolutely craves. The ambition to dominate the market is clearly there, and so is the financial muscle. But identifying the exact right profile to orchestrate this specific system, that's an incredibly delicate high-wire operation.
And that brings us to part 4. The existential threat, the Pep Guardiola factor. Guys, this situation is not just about replacing a name on a whiteboard. It is a full-blown psychological crisis. The experts on the City Ramble podcast summarize this creeping dread perfectly, saying, I think they've actually got their ankles tied together by rope. If one goes, they both go. And if one stays, they both stay. It's heavy, right? Because the symbiosis between this manager and his midfielder is literally everything. A manager like Guardiola doesn't make tackles out there. He relies entirely on his number 6 to act as his proxy, to translate his frantic sideline gestures into living, breathing geometry on the grass. Guardiola's personal motivation is heavily tied to the foundation he has painstakingly built. So if he's looking at his squad and seeing the very pillars of his system being dismantled piece by piece, it dramatically alters the calculus of his own future. Does he genuinely want to start a massive, exhausting multi-year rebuild from absolute scratch at this stage of his legendary career? Or does the loss of his ultimate on-pitch general signal that this specific, glorious cycle has just naturally reached its conclusion? Which brings us to the terrifying reality of a crumbling foundation. Because it's not just Rodri leaving for Barcelona. Bernardo Silva, the endless workhorse and tactical genius who covers every blade of grass for this team, is widely expected to depart next. Kevin De Bruyne is aging, battling his own fading hamstrings. And looming over all of this instability, like a massive dark cloud, is the undeniable fact that Pep Guardiola himself is entering the final year of his contract. Just imagine being the manager staring at a blank whiteboard right now. If you lose Rodri's immense control, and you lose Bernardo's endless stamina, does that make up Pep's mind for him? Look, it is one thing to ask a deeply exhausted manager to chase 97 points for a spectacular last dance. It is an entirely different demand to ask him to do it while completely fundamentally reinventing the very midfield engine that made his recent historical triumphs possible in the first place. The walls of the dynasty are starting to feel very, very narrow. Which leaves us with this final, profound question hanging heavily over the Etihad. Is Rodri's departure the beginning of the end for Pep Guardiola at Manchester City? The tactical void is massive, yes, we've established that. But the emotional and psychological stakes for the club's immediate future, they're astronomical. They aren't just trying to replace a £65 million player anymore. They are desperately trying to hold the fragile foundation of a historic dynasty together. How they navigate these next few ruthless months in the boardroom and on the pitch won't just determine the fate of their current season. It might just define the entire next decade of English football. So what do you think?